She's a senior New York Times political correspondent and a CNN political analyst, and she has once again filled the House. We are all eager to hear her insights about the upcoming election, which is, of course, a nail-biting event. This month has been full of October surprises, not the least of which are the neck-and-neck polling numbers for Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. One of Maggie's tasks at the Times is investigating the former president. This is her fifth presidential election that she's covered. She is clearly in the thick of things. She's author of a book about the former president, Confidence Man, The Making of Donald Trump and the Breaking of America. And she was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on Trump's advisors and their ties to Russia. Another team that she was on was a Pulitzer finalist for coverage of Trump's handling of the coronavirus. Maggie will be interviewed by, or rather conversing with, her father. This is, I am rattled, obviously. Her father, Clyde. Yeah. Clyde Haberman, a longtime Silurian and the distinguished New York Times reporter, columnist, and foreign correspondent. We'll have an audience Q&A at the end with Tony Guida and leading it. Now we're going to listen to Clyde and Maggie.
All right, Mags. Obvious first question, who's going to win? Perhaps more seriously, give us a state of play in terms of the Electoral College, of course, including Michigan and Pennsylvania in particular. And I should just make one note that twice in the last 24 years, the losing candidate in the popular vote became president, George W. Bush and Donald Trump. I assume it can happen again.
So first of all, thank you all for coming out to hear us. I apologize that I have to leave at 2. I've not scheduled myself brilliantly over the next 19 days. I think it likely will happen, that there is a split. I shouldn't say likely. It is a very real possibility that there will be a split between and this is what both campaigns are looking at as a likely possibility, a split between the popular vote winner and the Electoral College winner. Just for context for you all, and also this is my 6th presidential cycle, actually, just for full candor. Hillary Clinton lost by roughly 80,000 votes in 3 states. Joe Biden won by roughly 40,000 votes in 3 states. So depending on who you talk to, this will be an even closer race, or either candidate is going to win handily, and the polling is all over the map. So literally. So I can point to data that shows this as a margin of error race. But what that looks like, I don't know. Michigan and Pennsylvania in particular. Pennsylvania is a tougher state for Kamala Harris than it was for Joe Biden.
Why?
Because it's a lot of working class white voters who felt more identified with him than they do with Harris. And it's also just a state where ever since Obama won in 2008, Democrats have been losing some altitude. Michigan, there's an outsized Muslim and Arab American population, and that raises questions about what role the conflict in the Mideast is playing in terms of voters' minds, both Arab Americans and Muslims, as well as Jewish voters. And there are Republican efforts to try to drive this as a wedge through dark money groups. Teddy Schliefer, my colleague, and I reported on that yesterday.
I'm sorry, the money going to whom?
It's money that we can't trace. It doesn't have to be reported, but they're airing ads suggesting in Arab American neighborhoods and areas and targeting Arab American voters, describing Harris as very pro-Israel and focusing on the fact that her husband is Jewish. So there's a lot of cynical politics going on, and I expect that there will be more very soon. So that's a very long way of saying I have no idea who is going to win. I think if the race was today, based on anecdotal evidence and talking to both campaigns, that both teams think Trump would win. But there are 19 days left, and I don't know. Early voting has started in Georgia. It's starting in North Carolina, and I think we will have a better sense in about a week and a half of what areas of early voting states voters are coming from.
His speeches are incoherent. It's pretty clear. I know he says that he does a kind of weave, and there's a plan behind it all, but it's lost on me, and I'm sure many others. To what degree does his very clear cognitive problems sink in with voters, or is it discounted by those who either love him or hate him, and he's just been around in our public life for so long that there's no way to move the needle in that regard?
So I think a couple of things. I think I have a slightly different take on it than you do. I don't think there's been some marked difference between who Donald Trump was 4 years ago and now. I think his speeches have gotten darker. I think they're longer. He's certainly rambling much more than he used to, and he is more incoherent than he used to be, but that's like saying that he used to give, recitations of Shakespeare, and now there's suddenly this huge drop-off. I think that he has always talked this way. He has always had this discursive style. I mean, I remember being at a town hall of his in New Hampshire in 2016 when he looked up and saw an airplane flying overhead and started talking about that's Mexico, or he would make these word associations. Like he was like, we need to vet immigrants coming in. And speaking of vetting, we're going to take care of our vets. And so it's not like there was always some unnatural, sort of natural unspooling. I think he's really angry, and I think that comes through in almost every public appearance he has. But I don't think voters see that marked a difference because, yes, he's been in our public life for a long time. B, I don't think it's such a dramatic change. There is definitely a change, and Peter Baker did a really well-done story about this recently, where he used two examples that I pointed him to. I rewatched Trump at the Conservative Political Action Committee in 2011 recently to fact-check something for a story we were doing, and I was at that event. And yeah, there's the familiar, he's getting bored by his speech, and he's drifting off, and he's playing to the crowd. But he was much sharper, and I do attribute that to just being younger. That was 13 years ago. Go back and look at, actually, micro-targeting this to you, he did a review in either 1992 or 1993, a video review of Citizen Kane, and which is a big Clyde Haberman favorite. But
I'm hardly alone in that
I didn't say it was singular. Just it's one of yours. But it's jarring how much sharper he is. But again, I think that's age. So I don't know. It's very hard for me to say. I'm not a diagnostician. I do think some of this is just that people tune it out, but I don't think it is as pronounced for voters as it may be for you.
Does he realize that in Citizen Kane basically loses it all? I mean, it's really... I know it's off the mark a bit, but it's an interesting
it's an interesting point. I don't know the answer to that.
We talk about uncommitted voters. I'm struggling, frankly, to figure out who could that possibly be at this point. I mean, is there anybody who doesn't have an opinion, either pro or con, about Donald Trump? Now, whether it translates into a vote for Kamala Harris is a separate matter for me, but how can anybody truly be uncommitted at this point?
It's a good question, and it's a question that the campaigns ask themselves. I think you just answered your question, though, which is that it's not that they don't know enough about Donald Trump. They know everything about Donald Trump. And these groups of voters, roughly 11% across the battleground states in the tabulations of the Trump campaign, a lot of them are very turned off by Trump's behavior. The only reason this race is as competitive as it is when 28% of the country thinks the country is on the wrong track is because of Trump's behavior. Because people do have this nostalgia about his policies. A lot of it, I think, I don't think any of us have done enough coverage on this, and it's hard to cover because it's hard to quantify, but so much of when people talk about, a fondness for the previous administration or whatever, it's a fondness for life before COVID. And for a lot of these people, their lives were better in 2019, which was pre-COVID, and they associate that with Trump being in office. I think that Harris is facing something that she is not speaking openly about in a way that I think the Hillary campaign made a calculation to talk openly about, and that's about breaking a glass ceiling. But I think pretending that the fact that she's a woman might be factoring negatively into people's votes is, people are kidding themselves. It probably isn't a coincidence that the 2 times in the last, I think it's 30 years, that the International Association of Firefighters didn't endorse the Democrat in the presidential race, both candidates were women. It was Clinton and Harris. And so I think that people may be concerned about where Harris is because she did take a number of very liberal stands in 2019 when she was running for president, and she's tried moving away from them. They may be concerned about that. They may have inherent biases about her being a woman and her being a black woman that they're not going to voice to a pollster. But there's no way to quantify that either.
What are her strengths?
She's
no weaknesses that you've listed.
she's extremely effective talking about abortion and extremely effective talking about democracy. And abortion in particular is part of what the Biden administration liked having her go out and talk about. And she's energetic and she's young, and she, for a lot of voters, does represent a change, even though she is with
same administration.
Same administration. Yeah. It was very clear in the polling for years that Biden versus Trump was just not a rematch that a lot of voters wanted. And so she does have that as an asset. And she is appealing to a lot of people. But she is also a former prosecutor. And I think that the voters who prosecutors have to appeal to when they are elected is just sort of a different segment of the electorate than when you're running as a chief executive.
Perhaps a silly question, can the polls be wrong? I ask this only, I remember back in 1982, I was having dinner with a few people. One of them was David Garth, and Garth was, believed in polls the way, Orthodox Jews believe in the Talmud. I was asking, the California gubernatorial election had just happened, and a black candidate whose name in my dotage has just slipped out of my head lost. He had been favored.
Isn't it Bradley? Isn't it Bradley?
Bradley, thank you, Tom Bradley. And he lost to a guy named Duke Magian. And I kept pressing him on why did this happen. The poll showed this. And really, Garth could not come up with a sentence that didn't have a poll attached to it. And finally, he just threw his hands up in the air and said, people lied. And are they lying about this? Are people not going to want to vote for Harris because she's a woman or because she's part Asian or part black, and just don't want to tell pollsters? Or might it work the other way? So it's certainly possible the polls are wrong. I've had this Bradley effect discussion actually with a couple of pollsters, most of whom tell me they don't think that's a real thing at this point in the post-Obama era. They think that essentially people's race biases don't play in the same way, at least at the national level. I think, frankly, I think voting for a woman is just as a president is a cognitive block that a lot of people have, whether they admit it or not. But yeah, they could be wrong. They could be wrong in the other direction too. I mean, one of the things that you hear from a lot of, not Trump supporters necessarily, but Republicans who are resigned to Trump is, well, he's always overperformed his polls. So number one, that's all 2 times. But what I would argue is in 2016, the polling was actually pretty close to right. It was within a margin of error, and everybody just wanted to believe it wasn't true. In 2020, Trump performed vastly better than the polling indicated. The polling was indicating that Biden was going to have a 340 electoral vote
win or something. It was 306. He just reversed Trump from 2016. And in 2022, there was also a lot of, in another direction, there was a lot of miscalculating Republican support. There was this coming red wave that didn't happen, and there was a huge surge of voters concerned about the Dobbs decision undoing Roe v. Wade. And so I think that pollsters have had trouble accounting for the MAGA vote, and I think pollsters have had trouble accounting for the woman vote. And I don't know which one ends up being wrong or both are right, but there is an argument to make that the polling all showing Trump doing better this time than Harris, or, level setting or whatever. I think that the polling this time may have corrected or even possibly overcorrected for the Trump vote, and we're not going to know until after Election Day.
Let me ask about journalism. The Times, frankly as usual, I would say, is accused of bias. I know you've been attacked for either being, negative about Trump or overly positive about Trump. It's no great thrill, I would add, to be a father in that regard, and have to feel, what's wrong with your?
I'm sorry for your loss.
Yeah, I know. yeah, it's all about me. No. I mean, how seriously are these accusations taken at the paper? Are they, do they affect coverage at all? And frankly, are accusations fair in any way? They are constant to anybody who's either on Twitter or, as I am now, because I've given up on Twitter, on Threads. And to see some of the press critics, you would think that there was nothing but rampant dishonesty in the coverage.
So I think a couple of things. I do think the paper takes criticism seriously in general, but I don't think that means that they think that all criticism is on the level. I don't think all criticism is on the level. And I think that A.G. Sulzberger, who I think has been a tremendous leader of the paper, has a very serious commitment to keeping the paper independent. And people have not always liked the way that looks. And that has meant that we have been very clear-eyed about, for instance, Biden's struggles, in terms of his presentation and his public appearances. While the White House was telling people that we were wrong and telling people, that they shouldn't listen to us and so forth, and then the magic of sight at the debate on June 27th made pretty clear what was going on. And so, so that's one. The flip side is AG also wrote an op-ed that published in the Washington Post about the dangers to a free press of a Trump presidency. So there's this new phrase that people are using called sane washing, and it sounds very clever. What it's used to is it's suggesting that the we, waves hands, are all, deliberately trying to make Trump sound, I'm just quoting what the description is, trying to make Trump sound more coherent than he is or whatever. And what I would say, and I said this in an NPR interview, is I actually think the press does a really good job covering Trump. I think most of what all of you know in this room about Donald Trump comes from the coverage in the New York Times or Politico or the Washington Post or NPR. Or NBC, and then what you didn't learn there, you knew from seeing Trump decades ago, either as reporters or people in this city, and this notion that nobody realized that Trump was kind of a different person before he joined the political realm is just not true, number one. Number two, I think that Trump is a really difficult figure to cover because he challenges our processes every day. We don't run a YouTube channel, we run a newspaper. And so we're not spending an hour and a half airing Donald Trump's rallies, in their full form. There's no way for us to do that, and we shouldn't do that because he says all kinds of things that aren't true. And he smears people, and he says, all sorts of things, things that are really hard to...
Why not report that?
Well, we do report
it is reported, but
why
not more frequently, which is a question I sometimes hear from people.
I think that we report it a lot. I think that... It's an amazing ringtone, whatever that was. I just disagree. I think that we report it a lot, and I think that are there stories that I would go back, either my own or other people's, that I would look back on and think we should have done differently? 100%. There's no question. I don't think that everything we've done is perfect. But I think it's the result of people working on deadline, and we are all human, and sometimes the mark gets missed, but it's not because of some conspiracy to help Trump, which is how this gets portrayed on Threads, a website I'm not on, because it really has just become basically, tirades that are filled with things that aren't true about the press.
When Maureen Dowd covered the first President Bush, she quoted him at length because he really couldn't speak. He couldn't put a subject and a predicate together without violence, and one sentence didn't track from the other. And she quoted him at some length, which showed the incoherence.
We've done that a lot.
Is there?
We've done that a lot. When David Sanger and I did 2 foreign policy interviews with Trump, we ran the transcripts. There was another interview that Pat Healy and I did with Trump, where we ran the transcripts. Pat Healy and I did the first of its kind piece in this regard in November of 2015, looking at Trump's language, assessing the number of words he uses that are attacking, or his use of repetition, or the demagoguery. I think there is a distinction between this claim that gets made that we're all not covering him sufficiently, and the outcome that people who say it want to see happen, which is, and therefore people will stop supporting him. I don't think there is a single person who went into the 2016 election unsure that Donald Trump had demagogued immigrants, had made a number of racist statements, had made a number of anti-Semitic statements, was accused of sexual misconduct by 24 women, heard the Access Hollywood tape, proposed a ban on a religion. They voted for him. And so I don't actually think it's that the press hasn't done its job. I think the press has done a very good job. I don't think the press has done a perfect job. You will never hear me say that.
What is J.D. Vance's appeal to Trump and to the Republican Party as a whole? I mean, to me, he seems like an empty suit. And even his military record is, frankly, no different from my own. Nobody's ever called me a hero, that's for sure. But, I mean, he was...
Your children have.
I think that's the first...
That might not be true.
I think that's the first untrue thing you said. In fact, I think you should all walk out and protest this or something. No, I mean he did the same. He was an Army flak. So was I. I think he was in the Marines maybe, but I don't get the appeal, frankly. Leaving aside, whatever my own politics might be, what is it about him that Trump likes?
I do think your politics are a part of it. I mean, I think there's a difference between what is Trump like and what do Republicans like. And I was struck by what you just said about, sorry, it's hurting my phone hand. There's a difference between being an empty suit and being an empty vessel. And I don't actually think that he is an empty suit. I think he's quite smart. What I think he is willing to adjust himself into a number of different positions, not unlike Donald Trump. I do think that he has a core impulse on trade, which matches Trump's, and I think that's a big piece of the equation, and that comes from his background in the Midwest. And I think that he has an anti-interventionist streak, that not more than streak, desire. I mean, he's been very opposed to aid to Ukraine, that dovetails with Trump. And he's very good on TV, which is, I've probably reversed these orders, but I mean that he's very good on TV is, I think, the most important thing to Trump, because he goes on mainstream media interviews and lights into whoever the interviewer is, and manages not to get tongue-tied, and Trump loves that.
Do you have a sense of, I know you haven't covered this part of it, but speaking to colleagues who have, how worried are America's allies about Trump coming back in? Yeah,
extremely so. I mean, so Charlie Savage, Jonathan Swan, and I did a piece late last year, and we did a series that I would urge you guys to look at over the course of the last year and the beginning of this one about if Trump wins. And it's, you can find it on the Times website, but it's pretty comprehensive, and we looked at a lot of different areas where what it would mean if Trump comes back into office, and specifically what it means for the NATO alliance is the big question. There's related questions of what does it mean in terms of an Asia policy, Trump and Putin, which relates to Ukraine, but that also relates to NATO. And it's not at all clear what it means because Trump has been very vague, other than insisting that he may not, and he said this in office, that he may not honor Article 5 of NATO, which defending allies, if people don't pay their full commitments. Now, it's not unusual for a U.S. president to get upset about so-called free riders. Obama used to say this too. Trump is taking it to a very, very different extreme and threatening the alliance with it. And so, yes, there is a lot of concern.
So let's say Harris wins the Electoral College vote, and I would assume the popular vote. I mean, it needs to be remembered that the Democratic candidate for president has won the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 elections. This is extraordinary. George, in the second time George W. Bush ran, he was the only Republican since his father to win the popular vote. What form is the gearing up to challenge the vote in the Trump camp taking already that you can see? It's
a really good question. So Trump, who has never let go of his false claims of widespread election fraud, lies that led to the January 6, 2021 attack by his supporters on the Capitol, he gutted the RNC and he created something called an election integrity unit. The RNC is now led by a Trump ally who Trump incorrectly thinks worked some magic in North Carolina in 2020 related to how the vote went there. But this is why Trump put the guy in, and Trump constantly says things like, we're going to stop the steal. He still says it. So Republicans have filed a number of legal challenges recently, but they filed them so late that it seemed...
I'm sorry, but
challenges to how states are counting ballots or how things are being done and so forth. And they filed them so late in the process that it raises questions about what the goal is. Is the goal actually to impact the outcome, or is the goal to say, you know, we tried if they lose, right? And if it becomes something of a scapegoat. So there are a lot of actions there. On the left, Mark Elias, who is the super lawyer working with the Harris campaign, is very engaged in a lot of different states. I can't speak with any any depth about his activities.
Specific states that are targets?
I mean, they're the battleground states. I mean, they're looking at all the battleground states and states that you would imagine. Can I go back to one thing that you were asking about, though, about undecided voters? The big target for both campaigns is young voters, and Trump in particular is going after younger men. The gender gap this cycle is going to be massive. Trump has anemic support from women, and conversely, Harris has very high support with women and lower support from men. They're both appealing to younger voters, albeit different segments. Younger Black and Latino men, in particular, are more open to voting for Trump than any other Republican I can think of. With Latino men, it's been a trend. With Black men, it's also been a trend. But it's become more pronounced in the post-Me Too era. I think we lose sight of the fact that for younger voters, this era is what they know. The eras you're describing, you know, going back to the 80s, going back to whomever, whatever.
Ancient
okay,
history,
I remember
right,
them too.
yeah.
But anyway, but regardless, this era, this politics in post 9/11 America is what these younger voters know, and they are really turned off by politics generally. And that is across the board.
Well, does that mean they won't vote?
It means they might not, yeah. And it means they're harder to reach and harder to motivate.
And would that hurt Democrats? Is that a given that younger people tend to be more liberal?
It's actually, it's a likelihood. But again, there are these low propensity younger male voters who Trump is reaching out to also. But yes, the voters that you're asking about, and really that I'm talking about, would in previous cycles tend to skew more Democratic. There was a younger voter who I had talked to who told me that they were, and this is somebody whose family is in politics, that they saw no difference. This is when Biden was still in the race. They saw no difference between Biden and Trump, so they were probably going to vote for RFK. And so I guess like this idea that this is a news media failing is really another world conversation.
How much, you're mentioning RFK Jr., made me think of this question. How much are these so-called third-party candidates going to dig in, whether it's, I'm blanking on the woman's name.
Jill Stein.
Thank you. Folks don't get old. I mean, it's, or do get old, but have a better memory than I do. Jill Stein and as well several others who might, as far as I could see, would probably take votes from Harris more than from Trump. But
So it's funny, RFK is still on the ballot in some states. He tried getting off the ballot. And so there is a question of whether, and courts wouldn't, in some states, let him off. So there is a question of whether he will cut into Trump's cut in certain states, just because he really is the likeliest alternative there. But there's no question that Democrats are concerned about the impact that Jill Stein and Cornel West could have. Cornel West, incidentally, is one of the dark money, untraceable money efforts that Teddy and I reported on yesterday involved efforts by Republican operatives to keep Cornel West and Jill Stein on ballots. And so, yes, there's an open question about this. Now, I think that there are likely fewer Democrats who are going to vote for Jill Stein now than who did in 2016. I think in 2016, a number of Democrats who assumed Clinton was going to win voted for Stein as a protest vote, thinking their protest vote would not matter. I don't think that's going to happen to the same degree this time, but there's definitely a question about it.
I want to turn the mic to the audience in a second, but I asked a few friends, what questions they might want to ask you, and one of them was an interesting question. Has Trump ever shown a bit of empathy or concern for another person? It's
He has actually. I mean, this is not to be that person, but I did write a book about him, and
don't forget to buy it.
And there is and I get into this a little bit. I mean, he is capable of it. It's just really not his default setting by any stretch of the imagination, and it's not something that people see a ton of, and really haven't seen a ton of since. I think we lose sight of what this year has been. He was convicted criminally at the end of May.
And he's not done with the criminal justice system?
Well, depends on if he wins or not. No, but I'm serious. I think that's gotten lost too. I mean, if he loses, he's got a real legal issue. If he wins, these federal cases will go away and the state cases become impossible, even though he doesn't have jurisdiction over them. But the federal cases will go away. They're not sentencing a sitting president. He's supposed to be sentenced in New York on November 26th. So he faces legal jeopardy if he loses, which is an impetus in this race and always has been. But he was convicted criminally, was shot at, and then a week later his opponent dropped out. And all three of those, I think, have become one sort of big collection of threats in his mind. And he acts like someone under siege all the time, in public and in private. So is he capable of empathy? Yes, but I don't think it's the top 10 emotion these days.
Do you, one last question from me, and then I'd love to turn to the audience. Do people around him, you did interview him recently.
Not exactly. He called me and screamed at me. I didn't interview him.
Oh, I guess that's not an interview. But are the people, to the degree you can discuss this journalistically, I mean, do the people who are in his circle and around him, do they talk to you fairly regularly, or are you treated like you're a leper?
I mean, there's certainly stories I write that are I don't think, favorites of the campaign, but I mean, but they deal with me professionally, honestly. I have to say, just since we're having this conversation, the campaign that dealt with us much less professionally for a long time was the Biden campaign. And
how so?
Hostile, attacking, refusing to answer. There was just much more engagement from the Trump campaign over a very long period of time. The Biden team was not easy to work with. They just weren't. And so I think as much as I admire the words about a free press, how you act with the free press also does matter. The question was what I can tell you about Donald Trump's relationship with his children. It's complicated. I think that he has had a thaw with. I mean, I'm just answering the question as you asked it. So if there's something else that you're looking for, by all means ask. But he had a freeze with Ivanka Trump, who he was closest with for years, after her testimony was broadcast by the J6 committee, the House committee that investigated the attack on the Capitol and the lead up to it, because she was, I don't know, I can't say that she was fully candid, but she certainly divulged things that he found very problematic, and he prefers people not do that. He's very close with Don Jr., who is one of the people who pushed the hardest for J.D. Vance, and Don Jr. has become his own power center within the MAGA base, and I think that Trump is very aware of that. Eric Trump runs the business mostly by himself, and so that gives him a different entry point with his father. And Eric Trump was the one who was dealing with a lot of the investigations, and that I think became its own, and Trump has talked about that publicly. He's gotten very close to Barron Trump since Barron became a late-stage teenager. But I don't know that any of these are relationships that would be, similar to relationships. I mean, he is the son of a very gruff immigrant who was not exactly a warm human being, and I think that he has continued to comport himself that way with his own children. So you're closer to Clyde. Probably. But I might not spend as much time with Clyde as Trump spends with his children, so there's an asterisk.
So, Maggie, your last Sunday story that you did with several other reporters about Elon Musk was terrific. And it leads me to this question. Are women going to save the country, or is Elon Musk now the leading candidate to become the October surprise?
I honestly don't know how to answer that question. I don't think he's much of a surprise. Everyone sees he's there, number one.
I don't know what he could do on X.
I mean, I think X has become so unnavigable that, sure, anything could show up there, but I don't know that it would be him doing it or it would be someone else. It would obviously be allowed in a way. I mean, one detail that we had in that story was that Ken Klippenstein, a journalist, although we didn't get into that it was him specifically, but his account had been suspended because he posted some of the hacked documents that were taken from the Trump team by Iran. And I should just caveat what I was saying about Trump being under threat. They are under real threat. They are being hacked by Iran and facing ongoing attempts. Trump has been briefed that Iran is trying to kill him before Election Day. So that's not nothing. But these materials, these vetting materials from the VP search, were among the things that were hacked, and Klippenstein posted about, I think, a link to his own Substack on Twitter, and then suddenly was suspended. And we reported that the Trump team had had communication with Musk about this, and then he got suspended. He unsuspended him because his whole thing is supposed to be free speech. I don't know what else he could do differently. I genuinely don't know how to answer that. Musk has obviously decided he wants to be a huge force in politics, but I can't predict whether he's going to do something on that website.
Thanks. What's the deal with Melania? Why did she come out with a book, and is their marriage for real?
Next question. I don't do marriages.
I wanted to ask about this, since Trump has given this dark turn recently where he's talking about the domestic threats to our country rather than Putin and China. How much credibility do you give the assertion that was reported a long time ago when Ivana Trump said that Trump had a copy of Hitler's speeches in her bedroom? And also, given Trump's reluctance to, and if so, given Trump's reluctance to share his academic record, were they in the original German or English translations?
So, a couple of things. He's actually been saying this about the enemy within for quite some time. It has increased in frequency. He didn't have a copy of Mein Kampf. He had a copy of My New Order, which is Hitler's speeches. It's not the biography. This came up and was reported on by the great Marie Brenner in her piece After the Gold Rush, which included a lot of information about the divorce between Ivana Trump and Donald Trump. Marie was there before any of us, and Wayne Barrett was there before any of us, and both of their material is incredibly important. It was given to him as a gift by some Hollywood producer who told Marie that he thought that Trump would find it interesting. So yes, it is true. It's true-ish.
Hi, Maggie.
Hi, Eleanor.
So Trump has started talking about the enemy within and talking about the media. What do you think? What do you think he means by that? And what kind of reaction do you think, if he's elected, what will he do to the media? What can you expect?
I think that people should take him at his word. And at this point, his word, after January 6th, I really don't know how anybody is unclear on that. Although there are a lot of people who continue to believe he won't do what he says he will do because he didn't do everything that he said he would while in office that he promised to do in 2016. Now, a lot of why he didn't do all of those things is that he didn't understand how the federal government worked. In some cases, he got talked off of it. And in some cases, someone whose approval he wanted suggested something different, and he went with that. It will be very different this time because he does understand more about how it works, but most importantly, he will surround himself with people who understand how it works, which was a big difference and who won't want to stop him, and who, particularly lawyers, who instead of trying to prevent him from doing what he wants to do, will help him get to a yes. And the courts have become more conservative thanks to Donald Trump's previous presidency. So he is walking into a much more hospitable milieu, and this never gets talked about enough, in my opinion. Senate Republicans are feeling really good about their chances of taking the Senate, and I think with reason. This is not the Mitch McConnell-led Senate. Mitch McConnell's wing of the Republican Senate conference is essentially a rump. It is a MAGA-fied Senate, and they are going to be much more interested in doing what Trump wants than before. So, enemy within, we've been reporting, Charlie and Jonathan and I have been reporting since last year about Trump talking about using the military for domestic means. And he will continue to try to figure that out. He has been talking about delicensing. I'm trying to remember who it was. Maybe it was Comcast. He wanted to delicense CBS because of an edited interview with Harris. I think people should assume that he wants to try to find some way to exact a punishment on the media, even if it's not specifically what he's saying. If he can't do those things, I think he will try to do other things. And then just the last piece is, there's lots of talk about him, will he prosecute his opponents? He's been openly talking about that for 2 years, but he openly talked about it in the White House too. And his Justice Department looked at possible criminal cases against a variety of people, James Comey. Trump wanted John Kerry prosecuted for the Logan Act. I can go down the list. And so this is sort of my point about how there's not some dramatic change, either behaviorally or frankly in his speaking patterns. He has said versions of this for a very long period of time. He is just saying them all more intensely and with focus.
Maggie, we've heard a great deal about how much of an influence Trump's father has been on him, but relatively little about whatever influence his mother has had on him. And I'm just wondering if you've talked to him about that and what he says about it.
Well, what he says about his mother is he says she was a great woman and she was very elegant and she inspired his interest in the royals and I believe and sort of pageantry. But it was a household ruled by his father. And there was a quote that I found a long time ago from his other sister, Elizabeth, not Mary Ann, the judge who passed away recently, where Elizabeth was telling an interviewer, this was either the 70s or the 80s, why she and her sister didn't go into the Trump organization, or whatever it was called at the time. And she said, it's a man's family. And I think that sort of speaks for it.
Do you think a heavy early vote, like Georgia just had, favors one party over another?
I have no way of assessing that because Republicans have become more vocal about asking people to vote early. And Georgia is a state that has a lot of white rural voters who are likelier to be predisposed toward Trump. I have no idea what any of it will mean in North Carolina because North Carolina is still dealing with a devastating storm. And a lot of the areas that were hit are areas that would favor Trump. Does that mean that people are more animated to go find a polling place, or does it mean that people left the state to go stay with in-laws or relatives and because their homes were destroyed and they're not that concerned about voting? I just don't know.
Okay. We all know that after COVID and with COVID, our whole economy, as well as other countries, changed. So what was the economy under Trump like before then? Was it fantastic? Was it, a lot of people think, everything was great. But what was it like, before COVID really hit?
Well, it was, I can't compare a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic to normal, not normal, right? But the economy improved vastly after the fiscal crisis under President Obama, and President Trump maintained it. President Trump took two very significant acts. One was imposing tariffs, and he was told that on China, and he was told that this would have a devastating effect on his other action, which was the tax cuts. And the sky didn't fall, and so he used that to tell people that he was right. Unemployment did stay low. But he overstates the record, and he says things that don't comport with reality. But the main difference is that inflation was not, where it became after the pandemic. Biden was handed a mess. I don't mean by Trump. He was handed a mess just by life in terms of the pandemic, and it was global, and there were supply chain issues. The Biden administration feels very good about its COVID recovery efforts, both health-wise and economically, but for a lot of people, prices stayed very high. They're still high. I can tell you in my daily life, prices are higher. And a stumbling block for President Biden was, for whatever reason, he struggled to hear people on that and said, but the data shows X, Y, Z. And I contrasted a lot to how Obama handled 2012, which was a campaign I also covered, where Obama was very pointed at saying to people, yes, the economy is better, but I know you don't feel it in your lives. And this actually is about the voters and not about presidents thinking they deserve credit of any party. So,
Maggie, who is the one single individual who has the most influence on Trump, besides Trump?
You mean currently or historically? That's a really good question. There is no single individual who has the most influence on him. There is a handful of people who have a lot of influence on him. One is Steve Witkoff, who some of you may know from real estate, Howard Lutnick of Cantor Fitzgerald, who's now leading the transition, Susie Wiles, who runs Trump's World, basically. Melania Trump does still have a lot of input with him on specific things. And he talks to J.D. Vance multiple times every day. But there's no one person. There's no Svengali.
We hear that the two motivating poles are the economy, immigration, and abortion and women's rights. Do you have a sense of which is pulling stronger?
It's a good question, and it's actually one that we talk about on our team all the time. The economy and immigration remain the top two. Abortion was a more singular issue in 2022 when the Dobbs decision had just happened. It will still be a significant issue with more intensity in specific states or specific districts, especially if there's abortion rights referenda on ballots. But the economy is the main issue. Harris, in recent polling, has started chipping away at Trump's lead on the economy, in terms of the spread. Percentage of voters who say the economy, who would be better in the economy, it's within single digits, which it was not before, and not with Biden. But that hasn't translated into her gaining bigger vote share. So, those are still the animating issues, and they're a close one too.
Over here.
Hi, Maggie.
Sorry, the kneeling is confusing
This
me,
is
Tony.
a question I was actually going to ask you the last time you appeared here. You were on your little book tour then. You had just interviewed Mike Pence, who was on his little book tour. What did Mike Pence tell you about your book?
That's a great question. Nothing, and I'm now wondering if I should be offended. We talked about his book. I think that for a lot of for a lot of Trump administration officials, it took them a while to read my book, both because it was very long, but also because they had just lived it and didn't really want to relive it. So, but ultimately, Mike Pence is going to know more about certain aspects of what I'm writing about than I do.
Over here.
Hi, Maggie. Thank you. How do you see your career after this election? What do you want to do?
Survive. I mean, I don't know. I'm working on a book project with Jonathan Swan, and we'll see what the outcome of the election looks like, but I don't know.
I think this will have to be the last question as we approach 2 o'clock.
Thank
you.
you.
Joe?
Maggie, do you have any insights as to how Trump maintains his appeal despite of half the country, despite the fact that he's had these convictions, these accusations of sexual harassment, et cetera? How does he do that?
Because politics is defined and has been for the last several years by who you hate and who hates you back. And that is actually true for both parties at this point, but it has been truer for Trump's base. This was the fundamental issue in 2016, where Democrats were startled and surprised that the Access Hollywood tape didn't change everything. And in reality, Donald Trump had said all kinds of things on Howard Stern's couch, or had put himself in as part of the pop culture fabric of wrestling and of all kinds of other very heavy testosterone cultural touchstones for a very long time. That is how these folks knew him. And they knew him from The Apprentice, which a lot of voters thought was real. And so, which I discovered in January of 2016 in Dubuque, Iowa, when I was interviewing people at his rally. So the things that the press was describing of the nature you're describing, they didn't believe because they don't believe the press or the mainstream press. And because the last 2 decades have been so sour for so many voters, whether it was the fallout from the Afghan war and the Afghanistan war or the war in Iraq, or feeling, as if their military families were forgotten, which a lot of people feel like, or it was post-fiscal crisis when nobody was indicted at the top levels of financial institutions, and the bad guys didn't get punished, was their view. All coinciding with the election of the first black president. And so all of these factors are all part of a broader churn. But one of Trump's singular talents in life is this flattening effect on everything. Everything looks flat and the same. It's why he was so good at Twitter, was that he would just weigh in on various things and it all looked flat and the same. And he, for a lot of his followers, has equalized all of these experiences, so nothing is any different than anything else. And on the Manhattan trial, I mean, I know some Democrats who think that case should not have been brought. I'm not taking an opinion one way or the other. I'm just saying what I have heard. So it was easy for him to say to his supporters, I'm getting charged for something that nobody gets charged for. And this is a law that was sort of created, or use of a law that was used creatively to get me. And that's, for his supporters, the idea of somebody giving a big middle finger to a lot of people is very appealing.
Maggie, we are very grateful you could find the time to be with us, and it's been delightful again. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Papa.
And Clyde, you weren't bad either.
I've just got to, thank you, just close a quote I've always liked from a Uruguayan writer named Eduardo, I'm forgetting his last name now in my dotage. Anyway, he said, let's save pessimism for better times. So I'll do that. Thank you. Thank you all.